I want to acknowledge the musicians, incidentally, that we're singing here. I think it's always terrific. Music always does add so much to us, and there's something special about music that really touches you in a way that talking heads don't. And so it's good for us to be able to reflect upon some of the things that we hear. And I wanted also just to acknowledge that those songs that we heard, some of them were in our language, and they certainly were all about our culture. And I can remember years ago wondering why we didn't have more of that. And I'm glad to see that people like Vince and others are leading the way to ensure that our music is in fact brought forward in such a beautiful way. I also wanted to tell you that I looked around the room while they were singing, and I could see that half of the heads were bobbing and half of the heads were not bobbing. So I could immediately tell who the Mennonites were. And it was the ones who were bobbing their heads. Because you are a suppressed people, I know that. And whenever you want and find an opportunity to secretly enjoy the music, you take advantage of it. So I appreciated being here with you while that was going on. As part of my presentation here, I want to tell you a little story to begin with, because it's going to explain why I'm going to do what I'm going to do next. I've been a judge now for 26 years, and before that I was a practicing lawyer and one of the senior practitioners in the criminal law field here in Winnipeg is Greg Brodsky. And you know, Greg is well known for the fact that he takes on primarily murder cases and argues them in trial and in the Court of Appeal. And there's a story that's told about Greg that while he was appealing a case in the Court of Appeal one time, he started off by saying, "My lords, I'd like to tell you about the definition of murder." And of course, one of the judges immediately piped up and said, "Well, Mr. Brodsky, we're judges. You don't have to tell us what the definition of murder is." At which Mr. Brodsky said, "That was a mistake I made in the lower court, my lord." And so, I don't want to make the mistake of assuming that you know what I know, and that you know about what it is that survivors have been saying. And so I think we will take a few minutes just to listen to some survivors about what it is that they have been talking to us about. This video has been prepared for an audience such as this, even with children present, because there's no graphic details that are given. It's a video that has been put together from the testimony of survivors at our latest national event in Alberta, and it gives you a feeling for the emotion that survivors are bringing to the dialogue, but also they talk about some of the things that they have experienced both at the school and after the school.
The very first time I talked about the residential school, I said it was just like I had these skeleton keys, and I went through a door in my mind, and I would go to each door and I would open them, and this one was fear, and this one was low self-esteem, and this one was sexual abuse, and the list goes on and on and on.
I remember the loneliness, the crying, and being witness to all the abuse around me.
I feel like I've been dropped from the sky. Nobody around me, strangers around me. They don't know us, I don't know them. I don't know how to socialize. I don't even know how to love.
I went through sexual abuse. I went through physical abuse, mental, spiritual. And I'll tell you, the one thing that we suffer the most is the mental and spiritual abuse that we carry the rest of our lives.
My mother and father had 13 children. and every single one of us had gone to residential school. I longed for the smell of spruce boughs and of the smoke, wood smoke. I longed for the taste of the dried meat and the dried fish. I was hungry for all of that time for my own food. And there was such a longing in my heart, such a loneliness for my people.
This individual, this perpetrator of mine, this is what the individual first heard when he was talking to me. I said, I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry because for the last 50 years, I've hated you and I've wanted to kill you. That came from me. But that wasn't me speaking. That was that 7, 8, 9-year-old boy getting out whatever was still bothering him after 60, 65 years.
My youngest brother is named Michael Antoine. He's 12 years old. And my mom and I were together and we got a call. He's in the hospital. He was in residential school. I wasn't by that. I walked into the hospital and he was black and blue. I was never so shocked in all of my life. And then a few days later, we got a call. We're still in the city, my mother and I, and we got a call at night and they said he passed. It's about us, it's about my brother, it's about the children that never came back.
By forgiving the church, by forgiving the abusers, and not carrying all of that garbage with us wherever we go, we invest in our own healing.
People ask me, what do you expect to achieve? The answer is freedom. I am free.
Forgiveness is not for the weak. When you forgive, you grow, you heal, but most of all, you free your heart and you free yourself of anger, grief, blame, shame, guilt. Because anger is a spiritual sickness. But when you forgive, you actually live.
I'm proud to say that I opened those doors and I forgave.
Our failures fill us with deep regret. But as we know, regret and apology is not enough. The test of that regret and that apology, we know, will be our actions in the days ahead.
We are in the midst of a long and painful journey as we reflect on the cries that we did not or would not hear, and how we have behaved as a church. We travel this difficult road of repentance, reconciliation, and healing. We commit ourselves to work towards ensuring that we will never again use our power as a church to hurt others with attitudes of racial and spiritual superiority.
The Commission Chair, the eloquent Mr. Justice Sinclair, borrows a phrase that was used by the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. That phrase is, keep your eye on the prize. That sets a challenge for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, commissioners and citizens. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission will help define the prize. We as Canadians, as citizens, have to mobilize the eyes and help the larger Canadian population both see and act. Reconciliation in this context means coming together as a whole, with one purpose being to hear and to heal, and then a critical common purpose, which is to move forward together. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to go beyond apology and regret, if we admit the truth and ignore the reconciliation, that would be to repeat the profound offenses of the residential schools themselves. I believe that Canada, as a broad and generous country, could find the will to repair the damage of that past and build new partnerships if enough of our citizens know and if their eyes are turned to the prize.
About 4 years ago, the TRC sponsored an event and invited international speakers from around the world who had been involved in reconciliation movements to come and speak to us, primarily about the question of how do we preserve the national memory around events like occurred in Canada and occurred elsewhere in the world, so that people will never forget. And it was because we were looking at the establishment of an archive for the documents and for the statements that we were called upon to preserve. One of the speakers that spoke to us at that event was a fellow who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And you may remember in Rwanda, within a very short period of time, months, over 100,000 Tutsis were slaughtered in an incredible act of genocide in that country. This young fellow who came to speak to us was the head of their reconciliation movement, and he was responsible for the maintenance of a commemoration center to commemorate the victims of the Rwandan genocide. And he came and told his story about how they had built their commemoration center and what they were doing to preserve it. But in the course of his presentation, he talked about his connection to the genocide. He was a young boy when the genocide occurred, about 5 or 6 years of age, and was living in a neighborhood in his community in a large family, and all of his family members were living in a house, when they were attacked by their neighbors, people that they knew. And those of you who know anything about the Rwandan genocide will know that the attack was scheduled to occur as a result of a signal that was given over the radio at a certain time of the day, on a certain day of the month. And so when that signal was given, people set upon the targeted population and started slaughtering them, literally in their beds and in their houses. And so his family was attacked by the neighbors in the community that he lived in. And he was attacked as well, and he was left for dead. All of the members of his family were killed: his mother, his father, his sisters, his brothers, his grandparents. Every single one of them was murdered in his house. And he witnessed that, but he was left because they thought he was dead, and he pretended he was dead until he was rescued. And he grew up with this memory. And in the course of his presentation to us at the commission, he talked about why he had undertaken the work of maintaining the commemoration center in Rwanda. And he said it was because he knew that in order to be able to live the rest of his life, that he had to forgive the people who had done that. So what he did when he was a young man, and he grew up, he became a young man, he went back to his village, and he searched out all of the people in his neighborhood who had participated in the attack on his family, and he told them that he forgave them. And he meant it. And he talked about what it took for him to be able to say that and to live that forgiveness. And so he said that when he did that, it was an incredible process of reconciliation that he went through with them, because they felt so much guilt about having been brought into that role that they had carried out. And so he recognized that in his gesture of forgiveness, he had performed a very important act of reconciliation. And he talked about what that meant to him, and therefore he became empowered to ensure that commemoration center in Rwanda was established for the victims of the genocide, but also for those who were the perpetrators, so that they would understand the importance of taking that responsibility, so that they could not only be forgiven if they were ready for that, but to forgive themselves. And so during the break, in the course of that day, I went to him and I thanked him personally for his story. It was a very powerful story. Everybody in the room was listening to him, was crying, shedding tears. And we were all incredibly moved by what it was that he told us. And so I told him that. I said he had moved these several hundred people who were in that room with us. And I said, your story is a powerful story. And in many ways, I think most of the people in the room have a hard time understanding how you could forgive somebody for doing that. And he acknowledged that it was a difficult process that he went through in order to be able to do that. And then he said something that caught me by surprise, because he said, the hardest part is that every morning when I wake up, I have to do it all over again. Every morning when I wake up, I have to do it all over again. Because that's what reconciliation is all about. Every morning you have to make a commitment to it. Every morning you have to promise yourself or others that whatever it is that you did wrong, or whatever wrong was done to you, that you will forgive the person all over again. And so when you hear the words of these survivors who spoke about how they have forgiven the churches or the perpetrators or whoever it is that they've forgiven, you must remember that each day they have to do it all over again, because that's how difficult it has been for them to come to that point in their life. And so the issue about reconciliation that I want to begin with for you to understand is that it has no ending. It's not a state of arrival. It's not a place that you go to and you remain there. It's a constant, everyday battle. It's like fighting for your sobriety. You can't afford to back down from it one moment, because the moment that you do, you're back to where it was at the beginning. I've already told you a little bit about the mandate of the Commission, but our mandate is a very important one, because I think we have been told, even by the Prime Minister himself, but by many others in very significant places of authority in this country, that we are one of the most important commissions that this country's ever had, because this country now has acknowledged that it must come to terms with a historical wrong, but at the same time it must come to terms with the fact that the relationship that it has had with Aboriginal people is going to have to change. And that's going to change this country in some very fundamentally important ways, if it is done right. Mind you, if it's done wrong, it's going to perpetuate the wrongs of the past. It's going to keep things going in the way that they're going. It's going to maintain the improper power balance. It's going to maintain Aboriginal people in a position of impoverishment, in a position of victims of colonization, in a position of not being able to fulfill their status as a self-governing people, of ignoring the fact that they were a pre-existing self-governing people here for thousands of years, dealing with affairs well within their capacity for a long time before European settlers came here, who have rights, had rights, and still have rights within the territories that they occupy and within territories they no longer occupy. And if those relationships don't come to terms with those differences and the power imbalance that we now see in the assertion of authority or the assertion of blindness that we now see and has become part of our dialogue in this country continues, then the conflict will continue. And the tendency to try to teach children certain fallacies about the relationship will continue as well. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we do need to understand that the work of the Commission has been to try to gather together all of the information we can about residential schools, to make a report, and to educate the public about what these schools were all about. You need to understand that you can't look at residential schools in isolation. You have to look at residential schools in the context of the entire process that has occurred in the relationship between Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people in this country, between Aboriginal people and the government, between Aboriginal people and the churches. You've heard a lot about it from just that little clip of survivors. And I assume that some of you, many of you, have been following the work of this commission to this point in time, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. That's not what this part of our conversation is going to be about. But if you ever want to know about it, just take a look at our website and you can click and download an interim report that we call They Came for the Children, which documents all of that historical stuff relating to residential schools, but also that relates to the whole issue of colonialization of Aboriginal people since Confederation. We had an obligation to do the 7 national events. During the course of the national events, our intent was to provide an opportunity to educate people about what went on in the schools, but also to have dialogues around reconciliation. Much of the time that we spent as a commission was about recording the statements of the survivors. And it was because I think it took us a while to get the credibility of the commission back on track. And so we had many survivors who held back. Initially, we only had 300 or 400 who would talk to us at a national event. But that grew with each of our national events, so that at Edmonton, for example, we had 40,000 people in attendance at our national event, compared to the 20,000 who were here in Manitoba when we first started out. And so each of the national events grew in significance for not only the Aboriginal but the non-Aboriginal people as well. And so the education of the public that's been going on through the holding of the national events, I think, has been quite significant. Finding out the truth about what went on in the school is a challenging prospect, as you can imagine. People's memories fade over time, even if they have very clear recollection of having been injured. Sometimes they can't remember when or at what school. Sometimes they can't remember the details around it. And that may hold them back from coming forward and telling their statement, because they know there's something missing they're trying to fill in for themselves. And so as a result, sometimes they didn't all come forward. In many ways, if they had all come forward, if all 80,000 survivors had come forward to talk to us, we wouldn't have been able to accommodate them. But we're satisfied that we have received about 10% of those who were eligible to come forward and talk to us. That compares to a much smaller percentage of people who spoke to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or any of the other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have occurred around the world. So ours is well above the statement-taking process for many of those other commissions, because we made a concerted effort to go to them and to make our staff and time available to anybody who wanted to give us a statement. One of the other things that we have come to recognize is that some survivors have declined to come forward and talk to us because they truly believe that nothing wrong occurred within the schools to them, even though every single person who went to the schools had their language denied to them, had their culture denigrated, had their family relationships taken away from them, and lived in what could only be called a state of oppression, and many lived in a state of fear that what was going on to other students in the schools might happen to them. So despite those feelings, they still believed the propaganda that the schools perpetuated for its public consumption, which is that what the schools were doing was a good thing for these indigenous people, that it was there to educate them, even though the evidence is no education actually took place of any significance until well after the Second World War. That education standards, in fact, were not followed at all. People were not required to be certified as teachers, in that other than the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills that would go to a grade 2 or grade 3 level, most people never graduated from residential school to be able to go on to a post-secondary education afterwards. So that only changed with the passage of United Nations conventions, such as the Convention on Genocide, the Declaration of Rights, and others which established an international standard for behavior of nations that Canada realized they were not complying with when it came to Aboriginal people in this country, and so they started to change things. So that you begin to see in the 50s and 60s that in fact now more and more people are certified before they can teach in the schools. They have to comply with provincial standards when it comes to curriculum. And education is, in fact, what the schools begin to turn towards. But by then the damage to the children, the damage to the families, the damage to the relationships had all taken place. The schools were in existence for 7 generations, and you and I know that if you put children through a difficult time for 1 generation, you're going to have a dramatic impact upon the population for a limited period of time, but you can overcome that because you still have parents and grandparents who can help those children to heal from that. But when the children and the grandparents are also damaged by the residential school experience, each generation of children who comes out of the schools to those kinds of parents and grandparents do not have people who can help them to cope with what it is that they have been experiencing. One of the questions that we ask ourselves is whether or not we're ever going to get to a point where we will know the whole truth about the system. And at a presentation I did, I read this quote from Donald Rumsfeld, who many of you will probably remember. Famous person from the United States, but in his cumbersome way, he reveals a truth which is actually a truth that we have to live by, which is we really will never know whether we know all that we have to know about residential schools, because there are some people out there who may know things that are not going to talk to us. And as a result, we just have to go forward with what it is that we do know. And we are doing that. We think that we have come to a very adequate knowledge of what's going on in the schools to be able to move forward into the next process and to engage with Canada about what that process will be. At our last national event in Alberta, we made a point of mentioning to all of the people who were speaking to us that we want to have a discussion about the future. We want to talk about reconciliation. We want to try to talk about whether we can put the past behind us and move forward. And at our opening prayer, our very first speaker, Chief Red Crowshoe, said this, and I think it's such a profound statement that it bears repeating and keeping in mind as we go forward. Because he said, we may be through with the past, but is the past ever through with us? And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, because we may try to put things behind us, but it still has a way of reaching out and grabbing you from time to time without you even knowing it. And that's really all he was reminding us, was that we can work as hard as we want to try to put those things behind us, but they may never rest back there. So one of the questions that we want to talk with you about and with others as we go forward is, whether reconciliation is even possible. Right? Keep in mind that reconciliation is not a given. Just because we say reconciliation is something we're going to try to work on, is reconciliation even possible? That's the first question we need to ask ourselves, because the answer to it is important for you. And the way that you answer it is also very important to you. How do we reconcile is a question you need to think about. How do people reconcile? How do we reconcile the issues that we have to reconcile in our normal everyday lives? So you think about that and then try to apply those things to the conversation that we're going to have. What does reconciliation mean? Well, reconciliation, we sat down with our staff literally on the first month of the commission, and we said, what are all the possible definitions of reconciliation? And we came up with over 130 different meanings of reconciliation. How many of you here are accountants or do financial bookkeeping? You know what reconciliation means to a bookkeeper, right? Both sides of the page have to balance. A reconciliation means to a lawyer who's doing divorce work. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the same thing. It's a different meaning altogether. Right? So reconciliation has different meanings to different people in different contexts. So we have to figure out what reconciliation means as we go forward. And some people say that if you never had conciliation to begin with, conciliation I assume means a peaceful state of existence to begin with, then how could you ever return to that? What is it you're returning to? Does reconciliation mean that you are returning to something that you used to have? To reconcile means to go back to a more peaceful state in the minds of some people. And did we ever really have that? Some would argue that we did, and some would argue that we've never had it. So do we really need to have that conversation? But you just need to know that there are those out there who maintain this in a conversation. When we talk about reconciliation at the Commission, there's a number of points that we have to keep in mind that we think are significant here. And in the conversation that you're going to have and we're going to have with you, you're going to have amongst yourselves and hopefully with others as well, is you need to recognize that reconciliation comes at different levels. Victims have to come to terms with their own sense of victimization as a part of the reconciliation process. Some would call that healing. They have to be able to heal from the trauma of what happened to them. If any of you have ever been the victim of a break and enter, or if any of you have been a victim of an assault, or if you know what it's like to be the victim of a crime, an unexpected event from a total stranger, somebody who's done something to you totally out of the blue, or done something to somebody that you know and love, you know what that sense of victimization a bit is about. When you feel victimized, it's because something has been done to you that you just did not deserve. There's no way that you feel responsible for this, but you feel affected by it. You feel hurt by it. You feel angry about it. And so there's a whole bunch of emotions that come from that sense of victimization. And in order for you to be able to move forward from that, to reconcile with that, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. It just means you have to come to terms with it. That sense of victimization. You have to know how to deal with it. You have to know how to put it someplace so you're not constantly reliving it, or you'll be lying in bed every day for the rest of your life with your head under the covers. You need reconciliation if you're going to try to maintain a relationship. You know, if you're not going to maintain a relationship, maybe you don't need reconciliation, but even then, if you're going to decide not to maintain a relationship, you need to have some kind of an understanding with the other person that you're not going to have a relationship. Otherwise, you're going to be a victim of a stalker, right? So reconciliation in any kind of a relationship is a requirement, whether it's to stay together or to change the relationship you're having with each other, or to have no relationship. In other words, to maintain a separation, to maintain an apartness, to not deal with each other in the future. But even then, you need to have an agreement. You need to have an understanding. And reconciliation in that context is an understanding of sorts. You need to come to terms with each other. That's what coming to terms means, to reach an agreement. So you can see that reconciliation occurs at the personal level, it occurs at the family level, at the community level, and at the nation level as well, because reconciliation within the context of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people also is about kind of an intergovernmental or inter-societal issue as well. One of the things that we've had to deal with or had to respond to is the question of, can victims of residential school violence ever reconcile with the church or ever reconcile with the government? And that's a question we've posed to people who've talked to us about that. And one of the elders who advises the commission has said, I think it's impossible to reconcile with an institution. I think it's impossible because it's like trying to reconcile with the car that runs you over. Right? You can't reconcile with the car that's run you over. It's the driver of the car that you have to reconcile with, because that's just a tool. That's just a means by which something is done. So that's really the conversation. It's an interpersonal issue. Reconciliation is an interpersonal issue. But at the same time, political reconciliation is recognized as a known process as well, but there we're talking about treaties between nations or treaties between people or treaties between people and a nation. So there is a process of reconciliation as well, where governments come to terms with other governments over situations that have occurred between them. So institutions can have a process of reconciliation as well. So we need to keep that issue alive for now and decide where it fits into the equation. But it's a different kind of reconciliation than the personal kind of reconciliation that we need to look at between victims and perpetrators, for example, or between survivors and members of their family. Because many of the survivors talk about how they were victimized at the schools and they went on to victimize others after the schools, and they need a process of reconciliation for their own victimization of others as well. One of the things that as a commission that we've always maintained virtually from the beginning, and it was a difficult point to make and get people to understand, was that everybody in this country has been affected by what went on in residential schools, because what went on in residential schools also went on in the public schools of this country as well. In residential schools, you will have heard that all of the children, when they were taken away from their families and placed in the schools, were told from the beginning that they were inferior, they were savages, they were pagans, they were heathens, that their families were backwards, that their communities were backwards, that their people were inferior, that they were irrelevant to the evolution of this country. In fact, if you read the history books of the development of the nation of Canada, you don't find much mention of Aboriginal people other than as roadblocks to the development of this nation. And so as a result of that kind of discourse, people who were educated in the public schools of this country have come to see Aboriginal people as inferior, as heathens, as savages, as people who are standing in the way of progress. And even today, that message is very clear in the media. When you talk about media coverage, there's a really interesting book that's come out recently called Seeing Red. I recommend it to your reading, because it's about how the media have reported on Indigenous issues over the years. And what it talks about is that it highlights all of the conflicts between Indigenous people and Canadian society whenever Indigenous people are standing in the way of Canadian society wanting to do something. So it's whenever they've tried to stop what is termed progress, then the stories are really big. But when they themselves are the victims of some violence, such as a story of murdered and missing women, the amount of headline space, the amount of attention, the number of stories, the column inches that are given to that is much, much smaller. And they even, in fact, in the book, commented upon the amount of coverage that's given to the victims of crime when they're non-Aboriginal people and when they're Aboriginal victims of crime, and how much more attention is paid and much more sympathy is given to non-Aboriginal victims of crime in the media of this country. And as a result of that, that portrays a certain image of Indigenous people to our society as well. And from the perspective of the Commission, when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about how it's important for us to recognize that this is what went on in the school system, and that therefore reconciliation has as its objective the establishment of a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But in order to have that, firstly, we must talk about a way of restoring self-respect to Indigenous people, because the schools were all about taking that self-respect away and imposing its will about who they were and who they should be upon each of those Indigenous children. I've always said that the identity that Aboriginal children were to have comes from the very same questions that the identity of all children come from, and that is by knowing where you come from, by knowing where you're going, by knowing what your teachings of faith are, by knowing why you're here, what are your teachings of life about, and that helps you understand who you are. And for Indigenous children, that story of where we come from, that our history story, our creation story, was all denied to us. And so our sense of identity was denied to us in the schools, but not only in the residential schools, also in the public schools as well. And I tell you that from experience because I went to the public schools of this country, and I know what it's like to be educated in that kind of an environment. And unfortunately, it's still being perpetrated today. The children who go to residential schools, the Aboriginal children in particular, are still not being given a fair representation of themselves in the schools. It's better, but it's still not good enough. We need to talk about that. We talk about steps to reconciliation from the Commission's perspective. And these are some of the steps that we say need to be kept in mind as we go forward. And so I'd like you to keep them in mind as we have whatever discussion we're going to have, whatever discussion you're going to have, because I know and I understand that we're not going to resolve anything tonight, other than the fact that you're going to agree that I'm a great human being. But we're not going to be able to resolve all of these questions. You're not going to have as clear an idea about how it is you're going to go about your work as it's going to be once you complete this conversation for yourself. But these are some things we need you to keep in mind as you go forward. If you want to talk about steps for reconciliation, you need to understand that that which has been lost must be found. And this is true for everybody, incidentally, in any situation, not just for Indigenous people. That which has been damaged must be fixed. That which has been destroyed must be rebuilt. That which has been taken must be returned. That which cannot be returned must be restored. Those who have been hurt must be healed. Negative behavior must be changed. Negative attitude must be altered. All of that is true, whether it's a domestic situation or victim of crime, or whether it's any situation in which reconciliation is the end game. We need to talk about, well, then what is it that we need to do? There's a story that's been told if you read Archbishop Desmond Tutu's book on reconciliation. His best book is called God is Not a Christian. You read that book, and he talks about the fact that as reconciliation, and he gives an example of an individual who whose bike was taken by another villager in his community. And he was victimized by this villager who took his bike away. And eventually the thief came to him and said, "I'm sorry I took your bike. I'm going to ask you to forgive me. Can we move forward now? I apologize. Let's move forward." At which point the victim of the theft said, "Well, give me back my bike first, and then we'll talk about forgiveness and reconciliation." Because that which was taken had to be returned. There are certain preconditions to reconciliation that we recognize have to take place. And they're not easy things to do, because one would think, and one has, I have the impression that the representatives of the church parties to the settlement agreement and the government of Canada all think that all they had to do was apologize and then it's back to the game and everything's okay. Well, it's like a domestic violence situation, you know. If the husband has been beating his wife for years and then suddenly says, "Oh, sorry, I've been beating you for years. Can you forgive me?" And she might forgive him, and then he goes on beating her. What is the purpose of that apology? What is it really that has been achieved? Nothing more than his ability to say, "I've apologized for those wrongs, therefore you can't bring them back on me." That's really what he's trying to achieve. And in fact, some people would say that once you've accepted an apology, you can't bring back all of the things that have been apologized for. But in reality, an apology is never enough. It has to be accompanied by atonement. It has to be accompanied by a change in behavior. There has to be more to it. And so it's useful for us to know at the Commission that you, as representatives of churches, recognize that there are some next steps that you have to make, other than just the apology, because there are some next steps. And let's take a look at what some of them might be. And remember, apologies are never enough, but they are important. Right? You have to have that apology process in place. One of the criticisms of the Catholic Church has been, there's never been a face-to-face apology from the Pope. And many survivors say they want to hear that. They've heard apologies from archbishops, they've heard apologies from priests, they've heard apologies from significant leaders in the Catholic Church, but they've never had the Pope stand up in front of a group of survivors and say, "I apologize on behalf of the Church for what it is that we've done." And for some, that's important to hear that face to face. And until they hear it, they're going to feel that it's not been given properly. Apologies can be given in many different ways. You know, you can mail your apology to somebody, and for some people that's enough, but for some it's not. You can't mail in an apology when you're dealing with a history like this. It has to be something that is made sincerely and in the presence of others. The apology that was given by the government in 2008 by the Prime Minister and the various leaders of the political parties in the House of Commons at the time, despite the criticisms that have been made of it, I think was a sincere apology. I think it was an important apology. And at the time when I heard it, along with many survivors, it was a touching and moving apology, and one that we all saw was an opportunity for us to look forward to change. We haven't seen much change, and we'll talk about that eventually in our report, I think. But we know that apology has to be the precursor to reconciliation in a situation like this. But there has to be more. And if apology is given, then what is it about behavior and attitude that has to change? Respect is for us what reconciliation needs to move towards, mutual respect. And so we think respect must be stated. We think from the perspective of the churches, and I'm not telling you incidentally something I haven't already said to the church leaders. We meet with church leaders regularly at the Commission. And what I'm telling you now is what I've told them, and I've said it publicly at our national events as well, that churches have to make statements of respect for Indigenous people and for Indigenous belief systems as well. There has to be accommodation made for them somewhere in the practice of spirituality in this country and in the world. We need to acknowledge that Christianity does not own the forum. Christianity is not the only answer, and that's hard for Christians of many walks of life to accept. But you need to accept that. If you cannot accept that, then reconciliation is on you, not on the victims of this process, because that's a process in which you must engage for yourself. Then you must engage in a process of personal reconciliation to recognize that that is a conversation that has to occur before you can achieve reconciliation for Aboriginal people. Some people who've come to the discussion about reconciliation within the parties to the residential school settlement agreement believe that now that the apology has been given, now we can get on with the game of finishing our Christianization process of the Indian people. Reconciliation is not about furthering the assimilation process. If you think that that's what this is all about, that now we can get those Indians back into the Canadian system and do this right as we should have from the beginning, you're wrong. Because what you're seeing with the Idle No More movement and others as well is you are seeing Indigenous people saying, we're standing up to take your word, Vince. We're standing up and we're not going to take it anymore, and we are going to be what we were intended to be. Because now not only the law, but society recognizes that we have that right. But there are some people within some of the churches who will not accept that. And I understand that. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. I just understand that. Reconciliation for some people will be impossible, but we cannot hold ourselves back from that. Reconciliation needs to still be discussed by those who are ready, willing, and able to discuss it. And that's why, if reconciliation is about respect, then respect must be stated, respect must be shown, respect must be displayed in the behavior that we have towards each other. I've said often, and I'll say it to you, it's about how we talk to and about each other that's very important. And it's not just about talking about each other in the sense of the color of our skin, but what do we say about each other's belief systems? That's also important. And I want you to know that within the Indigenous community, there's also room for reconciliation here as well, because there are some people within the Indigenous community who have no respect for Christianity as a result of this experience and others. And that needs to be addressed as well. I'm not talking about only one side here. Both sides need to be prepared to look at the way that they talk to and about each other and change that position to one of respect. And I think God is probably talking to me right now. I hope he's agreeing with me. We do need to understand as well that there is still a need for us to recognize that the social needs of Aboriginal people, because they have been affected so badly by this history, are still an important need that needs to be addressed. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the social service programs that your churches run, that your organizations run, in which you feed people, you clothe people, you help people who are homeless, you help people who are in need. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you stop that because of this experience. You need to continue to do that because you do that well. You do that in a way that brings hope and helps people to live and survive. But you also need to understand that there is this other component that is also at play, and that's what you would call, or what I would call, a supportive role for the development of Indigenous people as a people. And you need to be prepared to do that as well. So it isn't just about the social welfare needs of Aboriginal people that you need to concentrate, but you also need to recognize, and many of you do, I know, that the evolution of Aboriginal societies as a society, as a self-governing or as self-governing entities within this system of governance that we have in this country, needs to be supported so that we can figure out how to do that together. So my encouragement to all churches is that however it is that you see yourself committing to reconciliation, that you continue to do that. You continue to do that supportive work that you do. You continue to do that helping work that you do. You continue to help to feed people and clothe people and take care of them, to ensure that their basic needs are met as much as you have in the past. But recognize as well that there are other things that need to be done. Many of the churches have gone that extra step and denounced, for example, the doctrine of discovery, which is not a legal doctrine so much as it's a religious doctrine. You all know that, I hope. You may not know that, but I'm telling you, the doctrine of discovery comes from the Catholic churches, papal bulls in the 13th century, as far back as the 11th century. And it was a way by which the church was called upon to authorize the colonial wishes of various nations around the world. And it did so. It participated in the process of empire expansion by creating this doctrine of discovery. If these are not Christian people, then they are not civilized. And if they are not civilized, you can go and take their lands. You can claim them on behalf of your sovereign. And it's therefore a fundamental aspect of old teachings from Christian doctrine that the doctrine of discovery has evolved. And so it's for churches to denounce it, and many have at the various gatherings. The World Council of Churches has gone on record as denouncing the doctrine of discovery. And so we think that has to continue, because the whole question of, in Canada, the whole question of Indigenous sovereignty and how you reconcile Indigenous sovereignty and Crown sovereignty is yet to be determined. And it cannot be founded upon the doctrine of discovery, because if it is, then all hell's going to break loose. Sorry for the expression. But politically, that will not be a very saleable commodity, and there's going to be a very difficult time. And I haven't only told you that, I've also told judges that. So I've warned them about being careful about looking at doctrines such as that. And we also need to encourage churches to look at continuing that work of partnership which many of the churches have begun to engage in, to work with communities, to help communities in their evolution, in their sense of growth, and not to concentrate on the proselytization, the missionary element of the work, which some communities are still calling for. And you need to respond to those calls. I recognize that. But at the same time, the focus has got to be, if you continue that and only that, many communities are not going to be interested in interacting with you. You have to be prepared to show a more supportive partnership kind of approach to things, because then it will also further your work as well and further and enhance your status, not only in the eyes of the people that you work with, but in the eyes of God, who puts us all upon this world to help each other in that way. So at one of the meetings with all the parties to the settlement agreement, I called upon leaders of the churches to ponder this question. It's a difficult question, because this is a challenge to doctrines of faith all over. Is it possible for the churches to make a statement that Aboriginal spirituality is just as valid as Christianity? If you can make that statement, then the process of reconciliation will be virtually complete, because that will be a statement of such profound respect, profound acknowledgement of respect and the importance of it, that it will change everything. And I've said to various people I've spoken to in positions of authority in government, in the legal community, and at some of our events, that statements, broad statements like this are very important, because they set the tone for the conversations that occur throughout throughout the community. And as an example, I say in the United States, as bad as the situation is for Native American people in the United States, socially they're in no different a position than Canadians are. They got more casinos and probably more millionaires now than we do, but nonetheless there are still communities with huge amounts of poverty and homelessness and economic and social problems. But in the United States, the relationship between the American government and American Indian tribes is different. And it's different because in 1972, the United States President issued a statement in which he said from that point forward that the relationship between the American government and Native American tribes was going to be a government-to-government relationship. So it was not going to be a programmatic relationship. It was not going to be a client-based relationship. It was going to be a government-to-government relationship. And everything that the government of the United States did from that point going forward was going to be measured against the question of does it enhance or reinforce the government-to-government relationship. And it changed everything in the United States. It allowed for greater freedom in terms of development at the American Indian tribal level, but it also freed the government from having to literally pay for the daily lives of Native American people on a daily basis. So it took them away from that wardship relationship, or that sense of wardship responsibility, which is a false sense, a false relationship. And it put it into a government-to-government relationship. And the interesting thing is that the president who made that statement was a person you would have thought would never have made such a profoundly socially progressive statement. And you know who that was? It was Richard Nixon, a Republican president who made a statement that has changed everything in the United States for the better. Most of the tribal leaders now will tell you. For a period of time, they weren't that happy with it because the government used it as a means to take away social program funding, but then it put the whole issue of the relationship on a different level. So a statement like this is an important statement to consider. Can you do it, or can you not? And to the extent that you cannot, then the relationship is going to continue to be as bad as the existing relationship is, because this is one that's very key. And I recognize, incidentally, that some might think that what I'm advocating is to get rid of all Indians out of the Christian churches. I'm not at all. People have a right to select whichever faith they want to follow, and I encourage them to do it. My grandmother was a Catholic and died a Catholic, and I said if she had been alive last year or the year before when Kateri Tekakwitha was made a saint, I would have taken her to Rome so that she could have been there at that time to see that, because that's how important it would have been to her. And I want you to know that I have a great deal of respect for people who follow the faith that they choose to follow. So I'm not advocating that people not follow Christian faiths. What I'm saying is that they need to know that they can follow their own faith as well, and that they will not be criticized or denied or told that it's wrong. And that's something that historically the Christian churches have done and need to undo. Need not only to stop doing, but to undo. So, I firmly believe that children are the means to reconciliation. I want to tell you this, you and I are useless to the conversation, except that we are going to set the tone for our kids and our grandchildren. Reconciliation is not going to occur in our lifetime, not as fully as it should, but we're going to set the path for them to follow. The relationship will not change as significantly as it needs to change within the next few years, because it's taken us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a long time to fix this, but it's going to take a concerted effort to fix it as well. And I want you to know that the children are ready for it, because I have a video I want to show you in which children talk about this. And I want you to know that they get it. They know how important this is. So with your permission, can I show you one last video? And then I'm going to sit down and leave it to you. We know that among you are the future leaders of this country. Among you are those who are going to govern this land. Among you are those who are going to make important decisions about reconciliation. And you are going to have to come to terms with this history that you're going to hear a little bit about. And we know that's a difficult process, but it all starts with three things. You must watch, you must listen, and you must show respect.
It's finally nice that we realize everything and we learn about it, what really happened.
My grandparents, my mom, been through this residential stuff, so I just really wanted to know more about it.
I've learned a lot, actually, considering that my grandma didn't tell me very much or anything. So I've learned what abuse they had to go through. I've learned when it started, how long it was for, when it ended. I've learned a lot.
I want to learn about what happened to my dad when he was in residential school, and want to learn the healing process and what will help with it.
It makes me feel kind of sad, for those kids, because it was torture. It's not fair. They just took them away from their homes, and they just go to that school. I just didn't agree with that. It's just really wrong.
It makes me upset when I think about it, because just knowing what my dad and his mom had to go through, it's really hard to deal with, I guess. I don't know. It bothers me a lot, and now I realize why my dad drank so much when I was a little kid, I guess.
It'll kind of change the way I think about things, how it would affect someone's life and their kid's life for generations. That's one of the worst things that Canada did.
I hope events like this just are able to bring closure to a lot of horrible things that happened, and I hope a lot of people now recognize that crime happened and that we need to make amends for it.
I'll never forget this day, because today is the first day they ever told us about residential schools, and if I ever see anyone that's Aboriginal, I'll ask them if they can speak their language, because I think speaking their language is a pretty cool thing.
I like being around this. I like hearing the drums and seeing everybody else and learning about new nations and all these new languages I have not heard of yet.
I think we should start a dance crew and start bringing back our culture, start speaking our language, and everyone should just treat each other equal.
Our traditions carried on and passed down so that all our younger generations, and so that my baby knows what happened in the past to her ancestors, and so that she can just keep bringing our tradition forward and passing it on to her kids and their kids and everything.
And I hope that something like this never happens again anywhere in the world, and the importance of letting people know is so that it doesn't happen again. And it's good for the younger generation to know that, so that we all treat each other as equal.
The reason I know that it's in good hands when kids are aware of what's going on. Antonio, the curly-haired kid who kept saying, this is one of the worst things Canada ever did, he came up to me afterwards and he said, Mr. Judge, I'm going to become Prime Minister and I'm going to fix this, he said. And I believe him, because he's full of energy, that little guy. Just amazing. But they all They all get it. We have brought thousands of children to our national events to ensure that they heard what the survivors talk about, so that they could understand why their parents were like they were, and that it was not their fault. It was not their fault as children as well, growing up with those parents when they felt mistreated and neglected and abused, or lost, or separated from their parents, that there was a reason for it, and now they know the reason. And that they also now see that there is a path for them, and that path is about finding out who they are. And our ambition as a commission is to get Canada to see that each and every one of us should have the right to stand up and say that we are proud to be who we are. And our children, my granddaughter, should be able to say, I am proud to be Anishinaabe, as I am. I say that frequently. And others have yet to find the strength to be able to say that. This history explains why, but the future should give them an opportunity to be able to say, I am proud to be Anishinaabe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this evening.